Namaste and welcome. This is Divyanshi Sharda, your host. The guest joining us for today's show is Shri Vishal Ganesan ji. Vishal Ganesan ji is an attorney, media commentator, and the curator of the Hindu History Project, which is dedicated to understanding how Americans conceived of the Hindu in the 19th and the 20th centuries. By focusing primarily on newspaper clippings, Hindu history aims to describe and contextualize how the average American's attitudes towards the Hindu formed and changed over time. Hindu history is a multimedia project that exists on multiple digital platforms, including Twitter, Instagram, and Substack. In addition to his archival research, Vishal has also discussed his work on podcasts such as Bharat Varta, Indus Think, and My Ind Makers. Vishalji, namaste and welcome to the show.
Namaste. Thank you for having me.
So, Vishalji, you've done some remarkable research on the history of Hindus in America, and you've even published it under, as we've already mentioned it, the title of "quote unquote" Hindu history with a very unique phrasing, if we were to note. Could you please tell us about this research of yours and what made you get drawn to it?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be a guest on this podcast, and yeah, thank you. So it started. It was very happenstance. I had come across the Library of Congress here in America. They have a very extensive digital newspaper archive, and everything is digitized and searchable. And I had come across this archive. I don't remember how I kind of stumbled across it, and it was just kind of a curiosity for me. I'd go on the database and I'd kind of look through old newspapers and just find, items that were just curious items. And then I think I was just like browsing and I came across an ad in one of these newspapers for a Hindu magician, right? It was like HINDOO magician. It was like an ad for an exhibit. I was like, what is going on here? Like, I was just kind of taken aback. I was like, especially that early, like early 19th century. So I saw this ad and I started wondering, like, okay, well, what's going on here? So I kind of started searching specifically for things about like Hindu magic or Hindu wizardry. And I realized that there's a whole genre in the 19th and 20th centuries of, American magicians traveling the country claiming to have access to Hindu magic they learned from fakirs or swamis in India. And so this kind of sent me down a rabbit hole where I started kind of searching more specifically to try and understand what was going on. And I started collecting all these clips. And my thought from the beginning was like, if you're trying to kind of get a view into what early attitudes are or what like the average American thought, newspapers are a good way to get to that, right? Because newspapers were so prolific. There were so many of them. They were published locally, they were published regionally, they were published nationally. A lot of these newspapers even published multiple times a day. So you had this kind of ongoing narrative and dialogue with the audience that I felt was very insightful for me, just to kind of get a sense of what people were saying and thinking. So, I started collecting all these newspaper clips and they were very interesting to me. And then, I kind of started doing more research. I started looking at secondary scholarly sources. And, one of the books that I rely on quite heavily is this book called Heathen Hindu by Michael Altman. I cite it extensively in my Instagram and my Twitter posts and on the Substack as well. But, that book really kind of gave me the intellectual scaffolding, I would say. So, I had all these random newspaper clips, and then I kind of, thanks to Dr. Altman, had this intellectual framework, and now it's, just a matter of kind of, finding this evidence and plugging into this narrative that I've tried to build out. But yeah, it's been a very interesting project so far.
So, as you say, your main source for the data was newspaper clippings and also this book called Heathen Hindus. So what was this book written during that period of time itself, or was it a new publication with the perspective of how things were back in the day in the 19th, 20th century?
Yeah, the book was written recently. I don't remember the date. I don't want to give you the wrong date, but it was written like, I think within the last decade, maybe. It's a new, he works at the University of Alabama. He's in the religion department there. So it's a relatively recent book, but I think, the methodological distinction that he makes, and this is, kind of related to your question of why I use Hindu with the two O's. I mean, this is still the most common question I get. And the point is, because some people find it offensive. I'll sometimes get replies on my Twitter that say like, "Why are you spelling it like this?" But the point I'm trying to make is that, in this time period of American history, it's not like Hindus were in America in any significant numbers. I mean, there were probably scattered populations, brought here, in some sort of indentured servitude or whatever, or even like, isolated pockets of tradespeople, but that we weren't part of the cultural imagination as, Indians or Hindus in America. So a lot of the material that was read, that was distributed, propagated in America at this time, it was furthering certain representations of what was fundamentally a construct, right? Like the Hindu with the two O's is a construct. And, that was kind of unmoored from the reality of actual Indian life and actual Hinduism. So that's the distinction I was trying to draw. And, Dr. Altman makes a really incisive point, I think, in his introduction. And I've tried to stay true to this methodology, which is that what these newspaper clips really tell us is not about Hindus in India or about India itself. They tell us about how Hindus were conceived of in America. And, and when you switch the emphasis in that way, it kind of changes your approach, because all of a sudden this becomes an American story, right? Like what was going on in American intellectual and cultural history that made them look at Hindus in this way? What role did the Hindu as a construct play in all these different sociological and theological disputes that were going on in America at the time? So that's kind of that's what Hindu history is focusing on, I think.
So if you were to give certain instances of the various newspaper clippings and the various projections of the Hindu community you have read about in the research that you've done, what would they be? What were the certain examples that you could tell our viewers about?
Yeah, so I think one of the sort of themes I've, now that I'm, I started in the early or late 18th century. I'm kind of in the early mid 20th century. And I think one of the framework I've started to use, and I think it accurately captures, what I've seen for sure, is I would say that there are three main threads, three main narrative threads, right? And these are all kind of reflective of certain, I would say, interest groups and different cultural trends in America. So chronologically, the first kind of relationship that America had with India was really a commercial relationship. So, American traders were running merchant ships between New England and India in the 18th century, early 19th century, and it was a pretty fruitful relationship. There was this East India Marine Society in Massachusetts. It was like a guild hall for merchants who were running these trade routes, and they would bring back like textiles. They would bring back all sorts of fine goods from India, and they were super popular. And these merchants, they actually operated through intermediaries in India. So they would go to Calcutta, and they didn't have their own trading house there. So what they would have to do is they'd have to build relationships with the native traders in India, and these traders would help them act as intermediaries with markets and all this. And so American merchants developed very fruitful, very respectful relationships with merchants in India, with the merchant class. And there's a lot of really interesting correspondence and evidence we see from this period that there was no religious angle to this interaction at all. In fact, a lot of these early merchants were kind of, and this was true of the early East India Company too, right? Like they weren't really interested in evangelization or kind of spreading Christianity, because their focus was the commercial relationship, and they didn't really see the Indians they were trading with as religiously backwards or pagan or anything like that. So you had this commercial relationship, but what happens is that in 1812, I think, you see the formation of this American Board of Foreign Missionaries, and this is an organization that kind of acts as a coordinating group for missionary trips into India. And you start seeing a lot more missionary literature that gets propagated, from missionaries who are working in India. One of the characters I focus on extensively is an individual named Claudius Buchanan. He was a very prominent figure in this story. He was an Anglican missionary, and he was operated in India for years. And he was famous for popularizing the Juggernaut, right? Juggernaut was the anglicized, rendition of the Jagannath Yatra, and this became, the kind of dominant image in the American cultural imagination for over 100 years, right? He, Michael Altman or Dr. Altman writes about it in his book, and you see it in the newspapers too. Is that the Jagannath was written as if it was straight out of the Old Testament? It's the seat of Moloch. It's literally this is the devil worship. And so, he wrote these very vivid descriptions of these Hindu religious festivals, and they really struck a nerve with American audiences who were so steeped in biblical lore and biblical literature. And there's a distinctive turn there, right? So you kind of have this commercial thread that was really based on this sort of, mutually beneficial relationship of commercial transaction. And then this becomes overwhelmed by this sort of Claudius Buchanan missionary thread, which is very much kind of grounded into this idea that like these are the pagan Hindus and we have to save them through evangelical activity. And one of the mechanisms that this worked by is Buchanan and others. There's a very rich body of missionary journals, right? So you'd have missionaries in India who would write accounts of what they were doing, their work, whatever, various like anthropological observations, and they publish these in missionary journals, and then the articles would subsequently get republished in the newspapers in New England, especially. And so you had this propagation of these kind of this missionary narrative, and it I would say that kind of became the dominant narrative. And so those are the two kind of first the two major threads, and I think the third thread is the kind of elite reception, right? So the Asiatic Society was founded in Bengal at 1784. I always forget the exact date. I think it was 1784. So William Jones is there in Bengal, and he starts translating these Sanskrit texts. And he obviously had his own motivations. Like a lot of the motivation behind this translation project was, they were trying to rule over the natives more effectively, right? So they were like, okay, well, we need to find their native law texts, especially, and so we can kind of maintain peace and govern more effectively. But there was the immense benefit too, right? It's because they translating these philosophical and spiritual texts, and those texts made it over to America. And you started having scholars of comparative religion, especially like Unitarians, right? Unitarians, very much like a philosophical denomination, a more philosophically inclined denomination of Christianity. They really took to these Hindu spiritual texts, and there was a lot of work done by these scholars to kind of disseminate the ideas of Hindu spirituality through, especially among like the elite of New England. And you see this develop. We don't have to go in depth treatment, but I'm sure listeners have heard of like the Transcendentalists, New Thought, like there was a whole host of spiritual movements in the 19th century America and 20th century America that kind of were heavily influenced by Hindu spirituality. So this is a kind of a long-winded way of saying that I split all the newspaper clips I see. I think broadly fit into these three different threads. And I think the interesting thing about Hindu history, and I think where the kind of real gems in terms of like what you can discern about American society comes from seeing how these threads interact, right? Because sometimes they're developing in parallel, sometimes they conflict, and sometimes they intertwine. And that's been a really interesting thing to see, just following the newspaper clips year by year, is seeing how these different threads kind of intertwine and interact. Yeah.
Yes, so you mentioned very interestingly that initially the relationship that the American traders had with the Indian merchants was not of a very religious kind, and they were not interested in proselytization in the beginning. But suddenly there was a shift because of as you said, the creation of the missionary society, whose objective was to conduct proselytization in India. So, in your opinion, how do you think the shift happened, and what could be the possible reason as to the creation, as to why this society was created so suddenly when it wasn't initially the objective of the American society as such?
Yeah, so I think, it's a complicated question, and I'll try to stick to what I know, because I think there's like a lot of history there, right? I mean, I think even in the newspapers, it's kind of interesting because you see a lot of articles. I posted a few of these too, but there is a lot of them of American, especially written by American missionaries and American religious figures who are very critical of the British, because they basically, especially during the East India Company phase, were really critical of the British unwillingness to engage in even evangelical activity more fervently, right? Because the East India Company fundamentally they were a commercial entity, right? And they wanted to ensure that their market for goods was maintained and that they could maintain peace for their commercial activities. And there's a lot of anecdotes about East India Company even patronizing like certain temple festivals, right? Like they would provide security and they would provide like soldiers and they would provide funding for temple festivals because they knew that that was a good way to earn the favor of the local ruler or the local elite. So the East India Company was very flexible in this way because they were really just there to kind of maintain peace and ensure commercial continuity. And they got a lot of criticism from a lot of missionary figures and kind of church affiliated groups and I think a lot of this changes post 1857, right after the mutiny and after the British government kind of takes control of India. I think things start to change, and that uprising is used as a kind of it's used as an impetus, like this, like we have to civilize these people so they don't rise up against us again. But I think just in terms of American public opinion, I mean, America is a very religious country, and I think the reach of these missionary journals and the kind of newspaper reports that were derived from these missionary journals were immensely influential, and the missionary groups, like missionary expeditions, were very expensive and they needed funds for that. So I think that it became a sort of the plight of the Hindu and these images of the Hindu, like just they became very pervasive, I think, in American culture. And you can just, even if you look at the newspapers from this period, like it's pretty remarkable, I mean, how prolific and how common a lot of these images became. And it wasn't just newspaper clips, like it was also like in theater and fiction. A lot of the newspapers from this period published like serialized fiction, and a lot of the serialized fiction was based in India. And and you see these kind of motifs reproduced in fictional writings, right? The society, like the savage Hindu, like kidnapping women, and then like the British soldier saving the women from the Hindu. So these themes are they kind of very quickly become pervasive in the culture, and I think that's it becomes like the dominant narrative, I think, of these three threads, especially like in that early mid 19th century period.
Yes, very rightly said. And do you think that this Euro-American view of the Hindus was directly transported from the Euro-Christian view that prevailed already in the continent of Europe with regards to the pagan community? And can we safely say that there is technically no difference between the Euro-American view and the European Christian view towards the polytheistic pagans as such?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think for sure, like it's very important to understand the intellectual background, right, of what was going on. It's a lot of the kind of American understanding of religion during this period was very much part of the Enlightenment project, right? And like, what do we mean when we say that? So, in the aftermath of the Reformation, you have all these different denominations and sects of Christianity that start to arise. And you start getting this, and there's also this sort of, championing of rationality and reason. And so these two things interact, right? Because for the first time, religion becomes an abstract category, right? Like I think prior to this period, you had Christians, you had Christianity, you had Islam, you had different religious traditions, but this was the first time you had people, scholars, theologians, trying to conceive of what religion as a category really was, as an abstract category. And part of this was motivated by a desire to negotiate disputes between all of these Christian denominations, right? Which obviously like had been engaging in violent, not just debate, but wars, between different Christian groups and Christian denominations. So there's this kind of this fixation on definition and categorization, and this was also I think further amplified by the colonial project, right? Because I think what happened was you had Europeans who were going to other cultures and finding that all these different people also had the sort of like religious impulse, whatever you want to call it, but they all had their own kind of like conceptions of the divine and of God. And so you had these same people who were negotiating all these Christian denominations, trying to understand how to fit this stuff into this category of religion, right? They were trying to systematize all of these different cultures and all these different belief systems into a single, umbrella category. So I think this is the kind of intellectual background, and you see that, in America, you see it's very influential. I mean, like, so the Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, right? They were committed deists, and deism was very much steeped in this kind of Enlightenment view of religion. Right? Deists basically believed that God didn't directly intervene in the world, right? Because this was not in accordance with reason. He was like a prime mover. He was like, he created the world and set up all the rules, and then it just kind of like went off on its own. So they were very interested in this debate too, and they a lot of the early kind of comparative religion literature we see in the 19th century by scholars like Hannah Adams and Joseph Priestley Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, they were reading these works and corresponding about them. But yeah, I mean, I think that one of the big themes we see among these early scholars, and it kind of pervades, this whole treatment of the Hindu, is this confusion about how to fit the Hinduism into this religion category that they have, right? Like, this is a constant struggle for them, and it's on the one hand, like, there is a sort of so there's this thing called the declension theory, right? And it's the sort of dominant framework, intellectual framework by which American scholars understood Hinduism. And so, the context here is that you had these scholars of comparative religion, and they got access to these philosophical Hindu texts or whatever. And they clearly recognized that there was some philosophical sophistication, and and there was like there was like a conception of spirituality and of religion that was advanced. But on the other hand, they were also reading these missionary accounts of the modern Hindu, right? And again, this is not like to talk about the veracity of these accounts, but this is just the information that they were getting, but they were seeing these accounts of, like, people sacrificing themselves at the Jagannath Yatra. They're reading reports of all these like pagan bloodletting rituals, like women throwing their children into rivers as sacrifices. So they kind of formulate this framework, or this theory called the declension theory, which is this idea that, like, the Hindus at one point had something approximating true religion, right? It was like this primitive monotheism that was somewhat close or familiar to the Protestant Christian worldview. And then over time, they just degraded further and further. And now they're like heathen idolaters, who are like sacrificing their daughters or whatever. So, you do see this sort of attempt to try and negotiate, this the Hindu, fit the Hindu into this framework that they have. But there's no question that, like, the pagan and the heathen were very much the other, and it wasn't just, in America. One of the important background pieces here is that, there was a lot of anti-Catholic prejudice in America, during this time period. America is a Puritan Protestant country, and there was a lot of paranoia about Catholic influence in public institutions, whether it was schools or the state. And so the Hindu, as this, like, became the quintessential pagan in a lot of ways, right? And in a lot of ways, it was these depictions of the Hindu were used to kind of scare the American public, into like, this is what will happen to us if you allow Catholics to come and influence our society. So, one of the clips I published is it's a comic from 1871. It was published in Harper's Weekly, and it's called the comic. I'll post it on Twitter. I shared it, like, in every presentation. I'm sure most people have seen it, but it's a really striking comic, and it's a very interesting juxtaposition of images, because you basically have a river, right? And then the river is labeled the American Ganges, and in the background there's the Vatican. In the middle ground, you see like a crumbling public school, and then on the shoreline you have a Protestant pastor, like, guarding a bunch of kids. And then out of the river you see these, like, Catholic bishops with these, like, reptilian hats, like, crawling out of the river. And so you look at this, and it's a very interesting juxtaposition of images. On the one hand, it's very clear that it is, the main the main purpose of the comic is to, anti-Catholic prejudice or whatever. But the kind of amalgamation of the Hindu, American Ganges, kind of shows how these were melded in the American imagination in some way. So yeah, I mean, this idea of the pagan or the heathen as the other is very prominent. I mean, it even shows up in American geography textbooks. Like, I published some clips from a geography textbook. This is Mitchell's System of Modern Geography. Dr. Altman talks about this in his book extensively too. And this was the most widely circulated geography textbook before 1900. And it extensively covers, the different world religions. It categorizes different different cultures into, like, their stages of development. Okay. And it also, it specifically talks about how, like, India is half civilized because they're pagan, and they have this strictly hierarchical caste system because they're pagan and they worship idols or whatever. And this is used to create a contrast with egalitarian democratic America, which is Protestant. So you see this sort of, like, the Hindu as the other come through, not in many contexts, for sure.
Yes. And do you think that this the perception of the quote unquote Hindu with the double O has continued to influence the modern conception of the Hindu community in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is it's a really good question, and I think one thing I've learned for sure, kind of just following these newspaper clips and following these threads, is like, these representations don't emerge from a vacuum and they don't disappear, right? Like, I think we kind of have this a weird, like, sort of it's like the bias of the present, right? I mean, we always think that, like, oh yeah, now, like, the past is so far away, it's like a different country, and like now we're enlightened, and like everyone's attitudes are based on, like, fact-based, rational, whatever investigation. And it's like, no, I mean, you have cultural attitudes that embed themselves within a certain culture or within a certain community, and these attitudes they manifest in a bunch of different ways, whether it's through fiction, whether it's just through kind of like common attitudes, and these attitudes don't just disappear overnight, like they kind of persist, they'll change form. They will, one good example, I can just give you a quick illustration. So, this the juggernaut I was telling you about, right? Like the Claudius Buchanan, when he wrote his account in the early 19th century, right? Like it was really like bloody, and like, he was talking about like the human sacrifice and all this. It was all fabrication, right? Like none of this was happening. I mean, maybe there were like, this happens, there was like maybe like a stampede or something, and people, were injured that way, but like there was no like human sacrifice. It was like just crazy fabrications.
Mm-hmm.
And so what he writes this account, and it leads to a lot of people get interested in it, right? They want to see it for themselves. So you have a bunch of other missionaries and travelers go there because they want to see it for themselves, and they realize that none of this was happening, right? Like there was no human sacrifice. There were no like temples like built with human bones or whatever. Like a lot of it was just total fabrication. But the narrative switches in a very interesting way. They don't really say that Buchanan made this stuff up. What they say is that it used to be really bad, but then the British stopped it. It was like it was thanks to like the British reform of these temple rituals that now all of the kind of really barbaric stuff is no longer there. So I mean, you can see how like the same narrative, it doesn't it doesn't correct in that way, right? Like it doesn't correct in the sense that like there's a kind of repudiation of what came before. It just changes forms, based on the kind of contemporary political and social whatever consensus. So yes, I mean, to answer your question, I think for sure, these three threads are still present in American society today, and you see it play out all the time. I mean, look at the yoga controversy, right? This is a great example. So yoga, I don't know if the listeners saw this story, but the state of Alabama, which is a southern state, very conservative, very Christian, they recently prohibited the teaching of yoga in schools because of its connection with Hinduism, right? And so you can see even in that attitude, like there's not just the connection with Hinduism, but also like, the kind of underlying that is these preconceived notions about Hinduism, right? A connection with devil worship and all this stuff. And so even in that, you see the continuation of these sort of narratives. But then on the other hand, yoga is a multi-billion-dollar industry in America. It's extremely popular. So you see how the sort of capitalist or commercial thread and then the Claudius Buchanan thread are kind of interacting there, and you can kind of tease out, how these developed in parallel and are now kind of intertwined. But it's certainly, these threads and these motifs are with us today, I think, for sure. Maybe in different forms, but.
So we can safely say that sectarian attitude towards the pagan, quote unquote, Hindu community is still persisting, and is it unabated? Yes.
Yes, I think the representations of the Hindu, like, that's what it's about, right? Like it's about, you had this representation of the Hindu that had developed over centuries, right? And now you have actual Hindus who are in America, actual Indians who are in America. And I think what's happening now is that people are becoming more aware of this asymmetry that exists, right? Because I think a lot of Hindus in America look at their own experience as members of the community, their own understanding of their religion and of their culture, and they're starting to grasp that that there's kind of a stark difference between their own understanding and the sort of cultural, the implicit cultural view, right? That kind of just exists in the background. And I think that speaks to this, clash between the representation and the actual thing. right? So like the question is like, well, you have, and I think the first step to fixing that is recognizing that, this representation of the Hindu lives on with us in sort of a phantom form, and it still impacts how broader American society looks at Hindu Americans, because those are the attitudes that have been persisting in American society for hundreds of years. Like I think that's why the Hindu history, like it's why I think the visual element of it is so important. Like I think that posting the actual newspaper clips and showing people the headlines and showing people pictures, like I think that really hits it home for people, because they start to realize like, oh, okay, like you can actually see that this is what people were reading and writing for hundreds of years, before we had even arrived here. And like, of course, when you are reading the same kind of stuff over decades, like, it seeps into the cultural imagination in a deep way, you know. So I think it's important to identify that.
So yes, right. Like you say, that there is this trend that does continue in the 21st century as well, and does continue to mold the perception of the Hindu community in America. So I'm sure there must be some sort of interlinking of this perception with the American socio-political atmosphere as well. So how does the Hindu community feature into the current socio-political matrix that is playing out in the States?
It's a complicated question. I think my answer on this might be, I think I kind of have an idiosyncratic answer to this, but I don't think that there is a Hindu community in America, frankly. Like I think we use this term very loosely, and we don't really think about what it means. Like I think we take it for granted, so when you say like, okay, if you say like, okay, the Hindu community in America, like, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, what are you actually referring to, right? Like, okay, well, you could say we're talking about people who are broadly from a Hindu background from India who are now in America. Okay, does that include their children then? Does that include second generation, or are the children of the first generation Hindu American immigrants also part of the Hindu community? If so, like what is it from a philosophical or religious background that joins them? Like I think that the issue is that, when you talk about a political community or a social community in a country like America, like you have to be able to kind of discern certain shared principles that go beyond just ethnic origin, right? In order to actually claim that it's a discernible community. And I think one of the challenges that we're facing now is that like Hindu Americans haven't done that. Like, I don't think that we really, have established, I think there are like, I think it makes more sense maybe to speak of Hindu American communities, like plural, like you might say that, like, for example, like the ISKCON community, right? Like ISKCON, like people who are members of ISKCON, like they're Hindu, they're Hindu Americans, and they have a very particular kind of way of, practicing their religion and their culture. And, they have very particular like social behaviors or whatever. So that's like one community. You might have like the Baptist community, right? The Swami Narayan, and like they might be another community. But I think speaking of the Hindu community as any sort of monolith is, it's very difficult, because I don't think, and it's a deep issue, because it goes to the heart of what makes Hinduism exceptional vis-a-vis other religious communities, right? Like we don't, when you talk about like a Christian community or the Muslim community in America, these are also not monoliths, but they're far more standardized compared to Hindu Americans, right? Like there's a lot of diversity among Muslim Americans, right? But ultimately, like there's some standard beliefs that if you don't have, 99% of Muslims are going to say that you're not part of the community, right? Like if you don't accept that, Prophet Muhammad is the prophet of the one God, right? Like that's a pretty fundamental belief in the Islamic community. You can't really, like, it's not really tenable to claim that you're a Muslim if you don't hold that belief. Similarly, like if you're a Christian and you don't claim that Jesus is your savior, that's a very clear test, is right? It's a test for whether you actually belong to that community or not.
Yeah.
With the Hindu community, there is no test like that, right? There's no mechanism by which you can determine whether someone is in or out. It's kind of very like, you all paths lead to the same, truth. So you can kind of do what you want, and I think certainly in my generation, as someone, I was born and raised in America, and I would say a lot of the second generation cohort, you kind of see the effects of this, right? Which is that I think that second generation Indian Americans who are from a Hindu background, it's more of a cultural identity, right? Like people will kind of go to the temple for the big festivals. They'll go when their parents ask them to go. They'll go to the Diwali parties or the Garba. But beyond that, there's not really any sort of like philosophical principles that unite them. That you can use to pursue any sort of like discernible political or social interest. So this is an argument I've been making for a while, because I think that sometimes we Hindu Americans, like, despite our success in America, are not successful politically, I would say, because I think that we take it for granted that there's a Hindu American community and we're not doing enough. Whereas in my view, it's like there is no Hindu American community. So what you can't expect, like you have to build the community from the ground up by articulating what your shared values are, your shared philosophical commitments. You have to, only if you have those foundations can you start articulating like, this is our political interest and we have to go try to achieve it, right? Or if this is in our social interest, we have to try and achieve it. So, I think sometimes we put the cart before the horse in this country, I think.
So, in your opinion, do you think that there isn't any adequate representation of the political views or even the ideological views that the Hindu American communities hold to the best possible extent?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's exactly the thing, right? Like, I don't think that we've articulated that. Like,
Okay.
if we haven't articulated what those ideological or political commitments are, then we can't complain about not having representation, right? So I think that you have to start on the ground level, right? And you have to build a community consensus that has a wide buy-in from the community, right? People from all backgrounds, people from all communities, and everyone has to kind of agree on a set of like, okay, these are what the principles we stand for, right? These are the things that we think we need to fight for in America, as Hindu Americans. And then you have to go about doing that. I think that sometimes we make the mistake of, looking at an event, a political event, whatever, that we perceive as adverse to our interests. And then we say like, oh, this is against the Hindu community. But it's like, no, you're assuming that there's a Hindu community to begin with. Like, until you are able to build like the institutional foundations of that community, you're not going to be able to kind of lobby or pursue your interests in the American political and social arena, I think. So yeah, I think it's we kind of have to start from start from the beginning in that respect, and try to kind of really think from first principles. What is the American Hindu community? What is it? Who is it? What do they stand for? You have to do it from the grassroots, I think.
So what you're saying basically is to create an ideological standardization for that matter?
I mean, I think it's a tough. I think that what I will say is I do think that we kind of have a tendency to fetishize the diversity aspect, and I think that can be a little bit dangerous sometimes. Like, I think that I don't think you need to have ideological conformity, like, but I do think that you need to kind of
at least on some issues, we can say.
At least on some issues, right? Like, you have to be able to find a consensus on certain issues, right? Like, and that while still allowing, like, I think the most beautiful thing about the Dharmic tradition, right, is the spiritual freedom, right? And this idea of like, S. Radhakrishna, right, in his Hindu view of life, says a really beautiful thing where he talks about how like the thing that separates the Dharmic or Hindu tradition from Christianity or other religions is that, the religious or spiritual experience is its own validation, right? Like, we don't a priori say that there's only one legitimate spiritual experience and it can only be achieved through this particular text or through this particular spiritual figure. Like, we look at the spiritual experience as like, it's self-validating, right? Like, regardless of where it comes from, like, it's valuable. So, that's a very beautiful thing and we should not compromise it, but you have to be able to unite around some sort of core principles, right? Otherwise, it's a very basic thing. It's pragmatic, right? Like, how do you expect to, you can't achieve any political objective anywhere unless you're able to marshal people and resources, right, behind a certain action. If you have a room of 1,000 people and each one has a different conception of what is true or what is good, you're not going to be able to engage in any concerted political action, right? So I think that, you do have to try and build a consensus, which might require, frankly, like saying like, okay, like, we know that you guys believe X. These beliefs are not in harmony with our broader goals. So, you're out, you're out of the room, right? And then that's just part of it. Like you can't build a political movement that doesn't, draw a line between what is acceptable and what is not. So I do think that this is if Hindu Americans want to build a unified identity in America that lobbies for whatever political or social goals, like you do have to kind of build that consensus. You have to have some sort of shared goals, shared values.
So do you think there are efforts being made in this direction?
I think that's happening organically, because I think what's happening now is, I think what we're seeing in America is, there's a lot of cultural and political challenges that the community is facing, right? And I think that people are starting to kind of wake up and realize that, like, ultimately, if you don't define yourself, like someone else will define you, right? They'll define they'll define you, and they'll define your interests, and they'll do it in a way that's not consistent with what your interests or even what your conception of yourself is. And that's just the way it works, And so I think, and this is also, part of the broader American story and broader American history. I mean, if you look at any immigrant community that's come to this country, right, whether it was Jewish Americans who came here in the early 20th century, or Irish Americans, Italian Americans, like, you don't just I think we like to think now that we live in this like enlightened progressive society that like everyone is welcome, you just have to follow certain rules or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, like, if you just look at historically in America, like, this is not how it works, right? Like, especially if you're an immigrant group that's very upwardly mobile and is disproportionately represented in elite spheres of elite American society, whether it's business, academia, politics, there is always going to be a backlash there, right? Like, there's only so many prestigious jobs, there's only so many prestigious college seats to go around, right? And everybody wants it for themselves and their kids. So you have a new group that within 2 generations has really, like, achieved things that I don't think anyone would have expected in terms of just success. And so but I think that there is it's natural to expect a reaction to that. And I think that it's incumbent on Hindu Americans to kind of understand that and come together and realize that if you believe that you have, because of your Hindu identity, like particular interests that you have to fight for, then you have to get together with other like-minded people and start investing in the resources and the institutions to further those objectives, right? And to propagate your own interests and your own message. I mean, this is just it's something that every community has had to do, and it's something that it's our turn now. So, but I'm hopeful. It seems like people are starting to wake up to the challenge, I think.
That's wonderful. And if I were to slightly shift focus from this identity consolidation that the Hindu community is currently experiencing in the States to the ongoing issue of racial polarization that's happening in the country itself. So how do you think, and what kind of an ideological position broadly do you think the Hindu community has regarding the race wars that are happening, the culture wars that are happening in the States right now?
I don't think there is, so one of the things about American culture is like the kind of, it's very binary in its understanding of race, right? It's white or black, like that's it. And it's always kind of been the situation where people who don't fit into one of those categories are always in this strange limbo, right? Like, so there's Asians have always kind of been in this
floating
weird
around
sort of floating around. So I don't think that I don't think that Hindu Americans really have a consistent ideological position on this. I mean, obviously Hindu Americans are overwhelmingly vote Democratic, right? And I think that and this has been true. It was true in the last election too.
What about you? What about you?
No, I can't disclose my individual voting behaviors here, but I mean, I live in California, so my vote doesn't even matter on a national level, But what I'll say is, this is, I think, ties back into the point I was making earlier, which is that I think the Hindu Americans often make this mistake of they fall into this like partisan, like you have some Hindu Americans who are like pushing for more people to vote for Republicans, right? And like especially during the Trump election, like you had all these people saying like Trump is better for, India-America relations, all this stuff. But this is also a trap, right? I mean, like at the end of the day, political groups, political parties are just an aggregation of various interest groups, right? Like they're just vehicles for interest groups, and each party is kind of an amalgamation of these different interest groups that are in tension with one another and constantly vying for influence within the broader party. I mean, it's insane in America, right? Having two parties to represent the interests of 400 million people, like
Yes.
it's crazy, right?
Very
So,
true.
so I think that, instead of fighting over like, okay, like what party should Hindu Americans vote for? Like, I think the first thing we have to do is define what your interests are, right? Because ultimately, once you are able to define your interests, then you are able to approach these things more transactionally, right? Especially on like the local level, right? And you're able
Very
to say
true.
like, look, like it's in our interest to achieve X, and this is like a swing district in some state, that's Republican or Democratic controlled. Like work with that representative to advance those interests locally. Like that's really how you make the change. It's not just like on Twitter, attacking people for voting for Democrats or attacking people for voting for Republicans. Like it's not going to achieve anything, right? I mean, assuming that you actually believe that there are discernible things that you want to, that you want to fight for, like you have to kind of start from the ground level, and you have to, make sure you have representation on both sides, right? So yeah, I think, again, it's very hard to speak about like what is the quote unquote Hindu American position in any respect, because I just don't think I think the signifier, there's nothing underlying it really, and nothing coherent, It's just a group of people who broadly identify with like a culture, or maybe even like broadly identify with, a country in South Asia, whether it's Bangladesh, India, whatever. I don't think that's sufficient to actually constitute a political community. Like you need to have a positive vision of what you want and what you're trying to achieve.
Very true. And it is a fact that to consolidate a political representation, there needs to be an ideological standardization. There needs to be an ideological solidarity amongst the people themselves. Otherwise, how will you coordinate yourselves into a proper body that has a sort of governmental representation, a governmental recognition of their interests? So you're quite right in that. So you were part of the Understanding Hinduphobia conference that took place very recently regarding the cases of growing Hinduphobia in the US, especially that led to the recognition of Hinduphobia institutionally by Rutgers University. So, firstly, how do we address this anti-Hindu attitude that is now on the rise in the States, and what could you tell us about this experience of yours in the conference, and how did it feel that this ultimately led to the institutional recognition of Hinduphobia?
Yeah, it was a great, I felt very honored to be a part of it. I felt very underqualified because I think the other speakers were very like esteemed scholars, and I was just like some random guy on Twitter, I felt like, but it was very I felt very privileged to be a part of it, and it was a lot of fun presenting the Hindu history work. And I'm very happy that the student group, the student organization, I think it was like the student senate or whatever. I'm very happy that they recognized the definition that was provided. It was very satisfying, and that's a blueprint exactly for how action should be coordinated going forward. I mean, this was a totally grassroots thing, right? Like organized by students at the university who were just like relentlessly highlighting this issue and drafting this definition. I mean, this is exactly how it should be done. So I think I'm so impressed with these Gen Z students. I mean, I'm I'm a millennial. I'm a little bit older. My generation, I think, is pretty indifferent to these issues. But through Hindu history, I've gotten the opportunity to interact with a lot of the Gen Z students. I'm very impressed with them. Like they're very kind of aware of these issues, and they're very like they're not shy, right? They're not like afraid to speak up about them, which is the most important thing. Like you can't expect people to just have sympathy for you because of your own feelings, right? Like you have to communicate what's going on. You have to communicate the problem, and they're doing that, and they're doing it in very effective and very suave ways with the social media. And so yeah, it's really was good to be a part of it. But I think to your question, like, how do you fix it? I mean, this is also a very long process, right? Because you think about it, like, academia, I'm a firm believer, like in, I think I'm not like a hater of the ivory tower, right? Like the academic institutions, universities are very important, right? Like the process, the process of knowledge production, of peer review, of like the high standards of scholarship, like are very important, right? And that's, I think as Hindus, I think we should always defend that academic freedom and and scholarship, and these are something that's so rich in our own tradition, in our own culture, right? But I think that that's a different issue from recognizing that the academia, especially with respect to Hinduism in India, is steeped in a lot of prejudices. I mean, this is just true, whether it's colonial era prejudices, whether it's Doctors Adluri and Joydeep Bagshi have done a great job of kind of highlighting the prejudice built into Western Indology, right? So I mean, we can defend academic freedom while also rightly pointing out that the kind of status quo in South Asian studies departments and in Indology departments is problematic. It's and I think the issue is in any sort of scholarship, right? Whether it's and especially with religion, right? Like you have the insider and the outsider perspective, right? Like the insiders in people who are part of the religious community have a certain way of understanding their traditions, right? Like the lived experience of their traditions, and then you have the outsider perspective. And I think that if you look at the way other religious communities navigate this, right? Like, all academics are incentive driven, like all other people, right? Like they're dedicating, decades of their life to doing a PhD in a field that has very few job opportunities. So they're going to go where they have publishing opportunities. They're going to go to where they have speaking opportunities. They're going to go. They're going to cite and they're going to publish views or articles and books that get them a higher chance of getting that tenure track job in a Western academy. This is all incentive driven, right? It doesn't matter like if you have a bright-eyed Sanskrit student who's like, I love Hindu culture and Indian culture, that 10 years later, they're going to write whatever they need to get that job, because that's what matters. It's driven by incentives. So this is the game that we're not playing, right? So if you look at, how other religious communities go about doing this, right? Like they fund scholarship programs. They fly scholars to academies, in whatever other country, maybe like, Italy or the Middle East, where they study under practitioner scholars, right? People who are insiders, but are conversant with the outsider perspective. And this is a way of kind of showing them that, like, look, we support you, what you're doing. We just want to make sure that you are familiar with our kind of view, our perspective, right? And then, giving them opportunities to share their work, give them publishing opportunities, like even publish books, you can have a publishing house that publishes scholarly works. So, I think that Audrey Trishke, right? I mean, she's a particularly egregious example, but she's a symptom, right? She's ultimately a symptom of a greater problem, which is that the system of academic study around India and Hinduism rewards scholars like that, and until you change the underlying incentives, I don't think that things are going to change in any sort of fundamental way. So, I think it's incumbent on the global Hindu community. We have to invest in knowledge production. We have to invest in scholarship. We have to invest in manuscript preservation. We have to invest in getting, and this isn't about, people also like get very defensive about like, Westerners studying this stuff. It's like, look, there's only so many people in the world who are willing to dedicate their lives to this. There's only so many people in the world who are willing to study Sanskrit for 12 years or whatever before they get a job. We can't worry about, is this person from India, or are they like, what is their, no, like you have to just find the scholars early on and extend that helping hand of support to them and show them like, look, like we appreciate that you're interested in these subjects, like, come to our academy, come to our institute, spend some time with practitioners and understand how we see these things. So then you'll be more sympathetic to our perspective. But there's no substitute for that, I think. India ultimately, like, hopefully as India grows and gets richer, they'll establish better universities. I mean, from what I heard, like the state of kind of higher education research, especially in the humanities in India, I don't think is very good. So, that's something that has to be invested in, and that there's no substitute for it.
Rightly said. And changes are being made. Recently, there was a drastic change that was made in the UGC syllabus by the Indian government. So we're hoping that more such reforms are on the way, they're underway. And we're just waiting for them to be planned and executed by the government. So fingers crossed. And so, yes, it was lovely speaking to you, Mr. Ganesan. Thank you so much for joining us on our show.
You can call me Vishal, so you don't make me feel too old.
All right then, Vishalji. It was lovely speaking to you. You have some wonderful insights on Hindu history in the US and the relations with American sociopolitics. Very astute observations you have made for our viewers to listen to consider, because these kinds of viewpoints are not really in the mainstream in the Indic discourse. And that's why we felt that a voice like you was very key to this narrative that we are building, to consolidating the Indic worldview, because we need to understand that there is a plethora of views that do exist. However, to sort of organize them, we need to have voices from every side of the spectrum, from every point of the spectrum. And you have provided some wonderful insights on the same. So thank you so much for joining us. Namaste and dhanyawad.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Citti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.